Welcome everyone to our last webinar in the WPA Evolutionary Psychiatry Section for 22-23. And our speaker today is Martin Brune. Martin is Professor of Psychiatry and Head of Division of Social Neuropsychiatry and Evolutionary Medicine at LWL University Hospital, Ruhr University, Bochum, Germany. He has authored more than 250 articles and book chapters, also authored a textbook of evolutionary psychiatry, which had its second edition in 2016, and is co-author together with Professor Schevenhovel of the Oxford Handbook of Evolutionary Medicine. Martin's current research projects include the analysis of social cognition and psychosis and in personality disorders, the association of social cognition and social functioning and nonverbal behavior, the effects of oxytocin on social perception and cognition in psychiatric disorders, also nonverbal interaction in therapeutic settings, genetics and epigenetics involved in social interaction and psychopathology in non-human animals. Professor Brune's research approach is grounded in evolutionary theory, that is, how and why cognition, emotion, and behavior in psychiatric conditions relate to adaptive function of psychological traits. His title today is Human Brain Evolution, Vulnerability to Psychiatric Disease by Design? ? So over to you, Martin.
Yeah, thank you very much, Riyad, for this very kind introduction. It's a great honor to be a speaker in the EPSIG webinar. And yeah, as Riyad already announced, I would like to speak about perhaps a bit provocative sounding issue. Is the human brain indeed vulnerable to dysfunction or even disease by its evolutionary design? So it sounds a bit teleological, but it's not meant to be. And I would like to try to explain in the next couple of minutes why I think there could be a kernel of truth in this proposition, even though I agree that it's a debatable or questionable approach to understand brain function and brain dysfunction in particular. Okay, let me briefly start with a few facts that I believe are well known to the majority of listeners in the audience. We know that the human brain contains about 86 billion neurons, and probably not just the same, but even a larger number of glia cells supporting neuronal functioning. So it's in fact exceptionally large. And if you look at human brain size from an allometric perspective, one easily recognizes that it's about 3 times larger and 3 times more convoluted or folded than would be expected for a primate of our body size. This largely relates to the size of the neocortex, whereas in contrast, the size of the so-called limbic system or even more primitive parts of the brain haven't changed that much during mammalian evolution and primate and human evolution. Interestingly, the adult human brain consumes about 20% of the total energy intake, even at rest and even when people are asleep. The energy consumption is only reduced by a few percent, but not much. And this is interesting because the brain comprises only 2% of the body weight. So it must be a very important organ, so to speak, that the whole body affords or can afford such a large organ. Of course, most neuroscientists would agree that the human brain is quite exquisitely designed, and perhaps the most complex natural thing in the living world. But we know that it's, for example, very vulnerable to the loss of oxygen supply. And also, and that's one of the topics of my presentation today, exposure to heat, and what evolution did to address these problems is something I would like to speak about in the next couple of minutes. Okay. Many of you surely know the famous work by Randy Nesse and George Williams, published almost 30 years ago. I still find this, this work entitled "Why We Get Sick" a fabulous introduction to the field of evolutionary medicine. And according to Nesse and Williams, there are 6 major reasons for why diseases exist. One is mismatch between design and environment. This is something psychiatrists are often concerned with, especially when it comes to stress regulation capacities. It is a, I would think, widely accepted hypothesis that in ancestral conditions, when humans lived as hunter-gatherers, the stresses were very different to the stresses that we face today. In our modern, so-called modern environments, especially stress coming from our social environment. For example, the amount of encounters with people we've never seen before, etc., are potential sources of interpersonal stress, and this was probably a bit different in our evolutionary past. There is also competition with other organisms. This is something people from medicine understand in a very straightforward way, because infectious diseases, for example, are some specific way how the immune system competes with the reproductive activity of viruses, bacteria, etc., etc. But of course, there is also, on a larger scale, competition with other organisms for food resources, etc., etc. And this, on the other hand, also includes the risk of predatory threat, which certainly was more prevalent in our evolutionary history than in present day. As an anecdote, I may add that in Germany, there is now a big debate how to deal with the growing number of wolves in German woods. So some people are really afraid and want to shoot all of them. Others are a bit more relaxed, but this is maybe a very ancient problem. Okay, another reason why diseases exist is that the human body is not perfect by design. There are certain trade-offs between different interests. I will speak about this in a couple of minutes, because this pertains, for example, to the compromise between upright walking, bipedalism, in other words, and human birth giving. Selection is also constrained by, in general, which is something inherent to all living systems, and this somehow relates to the trade-off story. Another important aspect is that what selection actually does is often misunderstood. And this is something that is perhaps more difficult for people from medicine to accept, that the currency of evolution is reproductive success and not health. So of course, as people from medicine, we are all interested in helping our patients retaining health or regaining health, etc. But this, strictly speaking, is not in the first interest of evolutionary processes. So here, biology and medicine may have different standpoints, which in part are at odds with one another. And finally, defenses, and this is work of Randy Nesse, defenses are frequently mistaken for diseases. This, for example, is illustrated best when you think about a low mood and negative affect, which from an evolutionary point of view is rather a defense or defense mechanism rather than a disease. And there is a long-going debate about what depression actually is. Is it a disease, a disorder, or maybe in some cases simply a defense? So, put in the words, again, from Randolph Nesse, this is a quote: "The body is a bundle of careful compromises." And in my presentation, I would like to illustrate this from 3 different points of view. Namely, one is developmental, one is neurochemical, and the final point I would like to make is an anatomical one. So please let me start with the developmental. There is an interesting debate about the causes why the human brain increased that much over evolutionary time. You see on the left-hand side that it's what I said already, it's much larger than expected for a primate of human body size. To illustrate this, think of the famous so-called King Kong model. If we were an average or ordinary primate and we had such big brains, our bodies would weigh on average 450 kilograms and our height would be about 3 meters. But in fact, we are just a little heavier than a common chimpanzee. On the other hand, we are a little bit taller, about 170 centimeters on average, but still the brain is large in relation to relative small body size. And what you can see on the right-hand side is also interesting because this graph shows how the basal metabolic rate is related to relative brain size in primates and humans. This is not sure if I can have a pointer. No, sorry, this does not work. Humans are above this line. The dot in the upper right corner is the dot for the human relation of basal metabolic rate. So in other words, we have a very high basal metabolic rate that is much higher than in any other primate. This is in relation with our relative brain size. This graph shows something similar. On the left-hand side, you see the metabolic rate or total energy expenditure for humans in relation to what is called FFM, fat-free body mass. So you see that humans are higher than all other ape species in this regard. And this is unusual because usually animals with small bodies have high basal metabolic rates, like mice, other rodents, whereas large animals such as elephants, whales have relatively low metabolic rates. And the reason why I'm talking about this is that this is probably an adaptation to the brain's need for energy. And this is only possible to feed the large human brain when the total energy intake is high enough. In other words, consider the average foraging time of humans with, for example, chimpanzees. Chimpanzees and in gorillas, this is even a longer time of the day. Chimpanzees usually forage 6 to 8 hours per day. This is much more than humans do, even if you consider how long a romantic candlelight dinner takes. So our feeding, the time spent for food acquisition and food intake is much shorter in our own species, because we can afford spending our time with other things than feeding, because during human evolution, we evolved abilities to prepare our foods, for example, by cooking and other means of processing the food, which gives us more time to spend for other issues. And conversely, a chimpanzee would never be able to maintain a brain of human brain size, because 24 hours per day wouldn't be enough to feed this large organ that we have. And on the right-hand side, you see another interesting aspect, and this concerns the yellow bars on the left-hand side, indicating relatively proportion of body fat. And you see that women more than men, but in comparison to other apes, have much more fat than the other non-human apes. And this gives us the opportunity to store energy that we can consume later. And interestingly, the brain, of course, has only limited ability to store fat, but it can extract resources from all other organs. And interestingly, even in times of starvation, or if you consider a pathological condition called anorexia nervosa, it is such that usually the body fat is reduced because the brain consumes the body fat as long as possible before feeding on itself. So only in very severe cases of starvation or anorexia does the human brain lose substance. So in other words, there is also a competition between the brain and other organs of the body for energy. Now, the developmental aspect that I would like to highlight is shown in this graph. You see that the human brain continues to grow postnatally at the same speed as prenatally for another 13 months. And in comparison, the chimpanzee brain just grows for a relatively short period of time, quite fast, and then the curve significantly flattens, in fact, much earlier than it does for the human brain. And the reason for this is probably that human birth is antedated by probably these 13 months, simply because a large human brain, for example, of a 2-year-old infant wouldn't be able to pass the human birth canal. And this is called the obstetrical dilemma. So put a little bit differently, the adaptation to having or evolving large brains was that human birth had to be antedated, so it's a premature birth of what one would say from a biological perspective, secondarily altricial offspring, which is very immature and consequently very dependent on parental care. Here you see the human pelvis in the middle, with the shape of which is strikingly different compared to the pelvis of a chimpanzee that is shown on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, you see the head circumference relative to the diameter of the inner wall of the pelvis, which makes human birth particularly painful and also dangerous. And here is what I would like to call one of the typical compromises. So upright walking, bipedalism, is associated with adaptations of the pelvis and the pelvic muscles, because the pelvic muscles, in fact, are adapted for holding things in rather than letting them out. So relaxing these muscles during parturition is very important, and has to do with the with hormonal changes, which also includes oxytocinergic effects, etc., etc. But still, it's a very dangerous endeavor for human women and their offspring. And this picture I find very interesting as well, because it relates to what I said, that the human birth is antedated by many months, maybe up to 13. And you see here a very old image taken by a German neuroanatomist, Paul Flechsig. This is at least 100 years old, and it shows the degree of myelination of a 7-month-old infant, and you see there is almost no myelination of the neocortex. There is some visible in the cerebellum and in the phylogenetically older parts of the brain. It starts to myelinate the limbic system, etc. But in fact, the point I would like to make is that it takes at least 20 years to fully myelinate the neocortex. So brain maturation is very much expanded in relation or in comparison to brain maturation in other primate and ape species. And as already said, this has, of course, profound consequences on on social life, and it could well be that the immaturity at birth has or is connected with the evolutionary emergence of the what sociologists sometimes call the nuclear family, and the greater family and kinship relationships. So in other words, it is very expensive, so to speak, to raise a child. And I think this is an old, it's supposed to be a very old African saying, it takes a village to raise a child, and this is probably very, very true. Okay. Next topic is, so I will now leave the developmental aspect and would like to speak about neurochemistry for a couple of minutes, and especially about glutamine and glutamate. Glutamine and glutamate are very ancient molecules. In fact, there is quite good evidence that glutamate was already around before the first living creatures evolved. So it was probably already there in the inanimate material mass very, very early, maybe 3.5 billion years ago. And in fact, it was long ignored that glutamate and glutamine can act as neurotransmitters. It was, in fact, denied for many decades and acknowledged quite recently that there is a profound role of glutamate for brain development. But what I would like to highlight is that there is also a downside. I will come back to this in a minute. In fact, this is really interesting research showing that human milk has exceptional high contents of glutamine and glutamate, which is probably required to feed a developing human brain. And in fact, during lactation, the amount of glutamine and glutamate in the human milk also continuously rises over time for the first couple of months when infants are breastfed. Coming perhaps back very quickly to the obstetric dilemma, another hypothesis that I find interesting is that it may not only be the mechanical problems associated with antedating birth, but maybe also a nutritional one, because it seems to be that the human placenta is unable to provide the growing fetus with enough sufficient amounts of energy beyond 9 months or 10 months of gestation. So it could well be that this was another compromise that emerged during human evolution for antedating human birth. Now, the glutamate is really interesting because it has manifold functions in the developing human brain. So it has important roles in neuronal differentiation, in neuronal migration, and synaptic pruning. But the downside is that excess glutamate is highly neurotoxic. So the human brain has to find ways to get rid of excess glutamate. With regard to human disease, it's known that, for example, after stroke or brain injury, there is an increased release of glutamate. And it could also be that glutamate is involved in the pathology of Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and ALS, as well as Huntington's disease. From a psychiatric perspective, the substance is also quite interesting because research has shown, at least in animal models, that developmental as well as chronic stress exposure may also lead to increased or excess glutamate levels. And for human diseases, this has been discussed for PTSD, depression, and anxiety disorders. Conversely, it is also known that early developmental and chronic stress has implications for immune function, because early stress induces a pro-inflammatory response. One could perhaps speak of a general behavioral defense mechanisms, but also neurochemical defenses related pro-inflammatory states. And in addition, there is growing evidence that there is a tight connection between the activity of the brain and the human gut in reciprocal ways. For example, chronic stress can alter the microbiome in the gut, which could cause the problems with regard to the production, for example, of short-chain fatty acids, which are necessary also for intact brain function. This is work by Brune and Dynan from Ireland, which I find particularly interesting. Now, let me briefly speak about the third design compromise, I would like to call it. And this is related to compromises that evolved in response to bipedalism, or maybe bipedalism itself was part of an evolutionary solution of a problem how to get rid of excess heat. You may remember that I initially spoke about the brain's vulnerability to heat, and primates have particular difficulties in get rid of excess heat. This is not so much of a problem if you live in dense rainforests, but it becomes a problem when you leave these forests and live in hot and arid conditions, as happened during human evolution about 5 million years ago. So unlike ungulates, like antelopes, for example, primates in general lack what is called a rete mirabile, so a miraculous net would be the literal translation. You see on the left-hand side that antelopes, for example, and hooved animals have such a carotid rete, which is very helpful in cooling the blood before reaching the brain. So in other words, as Wheeler called it, the antelope has something like a radiator and heat exchanger for the brain. And the primates don't have this adaptation. So Wheeler then considered that upright walking could be an adaptation to avoid the heat of the day, especially around noon. And you see on the right-hand side in the graph that the advantage of having an upright position in comparison to a quadrupedal position is not so large in the early morning hours or late hours of the day, but there is apparently a particular advantage around noon when the radiation is particularly intense. So walking upright reduces the heat exposure quite significantly around this time of the day. And like most primates, especially apes, humans are diurnal animals and not nocturnal animals. So this could be a significant driving force for adopting upright body positions, especially when lacking rete mirabile. Heat is not just a problem for the brain in arid conditions. It's particularly accentuated, I would think, in organisms that travel long distances. And this is what human, or at least already early humans adopted when starting to hunt game, for example. So even in our modest climate conditions, during a marathon, the body temperature, for example, can rise to 40 degrees Celsius, and this would be detrimental to the brain if there weren't mechanisms that keep the brain cooler than the body. And there are quite interesting adaptations in the human brain that actually help cool the brain. What you can see here on the left-hand side is that the vasculature of the brain is very dense, and this concerns the arterial phase as well as the venous phase, shown here in the graph A as opposed to B in the middle of the screen. And on the right-hand side, you see the drain, how the brain or the vasculature drains the blood from the brain via the venous system. And this has led to a couple of interesting adaptations that concerned the sinuses that you see here on the left-hand side, and the evolution of emissary veins that connect the brain's vasculature with the vasculature of the scalp. So heat can be delivered from inside the scalp to the outside via these emissary veins. And interestingly, there is also significant adaptation of the sinuses and the design of the sinuses, that in the upright position, so when we walk on our legs, blood is mainly drained to a venous plexus that is around the vertebral column. So it's not quite like a rete mirabile, but the venous plexus around the vertebral column is very, very dense. So this is interesting because, in contrast to upright positions, when you lie down, the larger proportion of the blood is transported into the jugular veins on the side of the neck. What is shown here in this graph is human system, or part of the human sinuses system, which was absent in an early hominid that is about 2 million years old, so like similar to Homo habilis on the right-hand side. So one could speak of an evolved brain radiator, first put forth by Falk more than 30 years ago. And this is interesting because the potential design failure or design flaw, on the other hand, is that the bloodstream in the sinus system is much slower than in normal veins. This has to do with the lack of a vasculature of the brain's sinuses. So the very slow blood flow comes at the risk of thrombosis, which is, of course, a condition that is associated with high mortality rates still to the present day. And there are particular risk factors that could cause a sinus thrombosis, including situation of parturition, but of course, especially women who smoke and use contraceptive pills, which is a risk factor in our present modern lives. The human brain has additional cooling devices that are not located inside the brain. One is that we are able to sweat, especially on the forehead, and the other is the drainage of blood via the ophthalmic vein, shown in this graph. And again, this is quite a good evolutionary compromise, but it comes at the risk of infectious diseases that could take the route via the ophthalmic vein, for example, causing meningitis or encephalitis, etc. Finally, I would like to show you this graph, which I find particularly interesting because it compares how efficient the brain cooling systems work in anatomically modern humans, shown. So the endocast of the anatomically human brain is shown on the left-hand side. In the middle, there is the brain of an Australopithecus, and on the right-hand side, the brain of a Neanderthal, all scaled to the same size. And we see this is work from Brune, that the cooling is particularly efficient for regions in the parietal lobe, and Brune and colleagues speculate that this is an important brain region for human cognition that is less well cooled in the Australopithecus and also not so well cooled in the Neanderthal. But to my taste, this is a bit speculative, but nevertheless, I find these images quite interesting. Okay. I think I can now come to my conclusions. Maybe we all agree that the human brain is extraordinary in its complexity, and even though there is interesting debate what caused the human brain to grow that large, it could well be that it was social matters that led to the increase of human brain size. Even though the human brain is also fraught with a couple of compromises, which include its slow maturation, its hunger for excitatory and potentially toxic neurotransmitters like glutamate. It's vulnerable to oxygen deprivation and to high temperature. I would like to discuss with you if these, what I provocatively call vulnerabilities by design, indeed put the human brain at risk for adverse events associated with these design compromises. And we could also speak about the potential consequences for clinical practice. Is this useful to know? Does it help prevent and treat certain neuropsychiatric conditions? This is something I would like to learn your opinion. So I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take your questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Martin. A lot of food for thought there for us, and let me see if there are any questions in or any hands raised. If not, I will kick off the discussion. So two aspects that sort of arise from your presentations, which caught my attention, which are the delayed myelination of the brain circuits in the human brain, and also the issues about cooling the brain. So, I mean, can you comment about what weight do you give these two aspects with regards to the vulnerability to mental disorders? Do you think that the myelination or the delayed myelination until the age of 20 or beyond, is that, do you think, a particularly noteworthy issue, or do you think that the cooling issues are more important?
Thank you. That's a very good question, Riyad. I think the myelination story is interesting from a developmental perspective, because it could simply be the time that elapses from birth to full maturation that is the risk for insults or dysfunction emerging during this development. We also know there is a lot of rearrangement of within the brain around puberty, etc., etc. I think these are all potential risk factors. If something goes wrong during this period, the risk for psychiatric disorder may increase. Specifically, not sure if there is a connection, but as we know that psychiatric disorders manifest around adolescence and early adulthood, this could eventually also be related to the fact that these dysfunctions emerged shortly after the brain has apparently reached its maximum myelination. It's a bit speculative, I admit.
What do we know? What do we know, Martin, about the correlation between myelination or lack of it and the onset of schizophrenia?
Oh, wow, that's very a very good question. The myelination is, as far as I know, a bit delayed in people who later develop schizophrenia. I'm more certain for people with ADHD. There is a even more significant delay in myelination.
I was thinking of schizophrenia because of the fact that it has its typical onset before the age of 20. I mean, it's not universally the case, of course. The risk continues right through until the early 30s, but the peak risk, certainly in men, in males, is before the age of 20. And I was just wondering whether there is a correlation between the risk of schizophrenia and disorders of myelination or delays or whatever.
Yeah, I try to remember older literature from Randall, who this is literature from the 90s, who was proposing that there is a dysfunctional myelination process that could play a role in schizophrenia. It's a long time that I read this article, I have to say. So I'd be happy to look it up. And
yeah. I mean, I was thinking whether, rather than causing schizophrenia, that it may create a vulnerability. This delayed myelination may create a vulnerability which may interact with certain environmental circumstances to then push it off the cliff, so to speak. Do you think that's a reasonable thing to think about?
Yes, I think this is very plausible. Not sure if it's specific for schizophrenia. That might not be the case, but I think this is a very plausible hypothesis. Yes.
Okay.
The other question was about the radiator hypothesis.
Yeah.
I would have difficulties in connecting this hypothesis to psychiatric disorders. I think this is more relevant for neurological consequences. What can happen if the radiator fails to function properly, etc. So I think blood clotting is, of course, a potential problem. associated with dysfunction of the brain's radiator. And also, as I try to explain, the ways pathogenic germs can enter the brain is perhaps facilitated by the specific design of the brain's cooling system. That's the point I wish to make.
Yeah. So we have a hand raised by Muzaffar. Muzaffar, do you want to unmute yourself and go ahead, please?
Yeah. Thanks, Martin. It's great to see you. I think you mentioned some work from Andrew Miller about the immune system, which is one of the kind of hot topics in psychiatry these days. So my question is, what do you think about the systemic inflammation, and does it have to involve the brain? I mean, arguably through the immune cells and the glia, and the interference with the blood-brain barrier. There are some arguments, but what if the systemic inflammation on its own is a risk factor for mental health conditions without necessarily changing the brain, or without directly changing the brain? So what are your views on that? I think you might also think about the mismatch of metabolic syndrome and things like that. So obviously chronic low-grade inflammation is very, very common in kind of Western societies. So I mean, I think this is quite a bit of a interesting topic in terms of the mechanisms at the moment, because the tools we have, the imaging tools we have, do not really show increased inflammation in the brain. I mean, obviously our tools may not be good enough, but my question is, like, is it necessary to show some sort of neuroinflammation, or is systemic inflammation enough to create vulnerabilities?
Wow, Mustafa, good to see you, and thanks for the question. I think this it's a very tricky question. Well, I'm not an expert in immunology, but what I learned is that inflammatory processes have effects on brain function. I think what has changed in recent years is to look at brain function as if it were an organ in isolation. So there is much more interaction between the brain and the rest of the body, and an interesting discussion about the function of the blood-brain barrier also suggests that there is much more exchange between the periphery, if you want to call it like that, and the brain, which includes inflammatory processes. I just recently came across an interesting article showing that psychosocial stress in an animal model produces peripheral inflammation, it apparently there is also kind of feedback loop, if that's an appropriate term for that peripheral inflammation has also an effect on brain function, particularly microglia function and so forth. What is well known for many years is that, for example, autoimmune disease is very frequently associated with mental disorder, which not only includes the classical diseases like Crohn's disease or colitis, etc., but also autoimmune thyroiditis and so forth. So there seems to be a connection between immunological, including autoimmunological problems with mental function, and also vice versa. I'm sure you are all familiar with the work of Markus Rantala, who's suggesting that a a certain proportion of people suffering from depression have inflammatory problems. This is, I find, a very interesting idea as well.
So I can't see any other hands, but I'll ask
Adam's
you.
Hand. There, I see Adam's hand.
Is that Adam?
Yes.
I can't see his hand. Okay,
It's physical.
Adam,
It's physical. It's not
unmute and go ahead, please.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks.
Hello.
Thanks, Martin. Really fascinating stuff. So as a kind of young...
Adam, before you ask your question, can I ask you, Martin, to stop sharing so we can have a screen where we can see people's faces who are asking questions.
Yeah. Yes.
Excellent.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Adam.
So as a kind of young researcher coming into the field and looking at neuro, I started getting really interested in 2015, and then 2018 comes around and everyone starts asking questions about replication and why we're not able to find specific pathways or pathologies that we were sort of hoping for and that was so promising. So this is kind of more of a general question, and I'm interested to kind of hear your take on it, on the replication crisis. What do you make of it? Firstly, is it that, when we're putting a load of people with schizophrenia in a scanner, then there's too many different things going on there, so you're clustering a heterogeneous load of pathologies, and so you're not able to find a correlation? Is it, what else could it be? And also, from the evolutionary perspective, some of these principles you've talked about of why human brains are unique or unusual, and why that might lead to vulnerability. Is there anything that we can say as evolutionary psychiatrists or scientists? Is there anything we can say to neuroscience, or a direction which might find something replicable, or some way to sort of pin down a pathological pathway? And are you optimistic about the sort of things you've mentioned in this lecture for doing that? Yes, those are my questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Adam. To be honest, I'm not that optimistic, because I believe one of the major problems is phenotyping psychopathological conditions correctly. So I think there is too much variation. So that's why you have difficulties replicating neuroimaging, genetic or whatever findings in relation to schizophrenia or any other psychiatric disorder. I think that's the main obstacle. I'm not sure, on the other hand, if it's if an approach utilizing the research domain criteria would be more fruitful, like looking at people with increased impulsivity across a spectrum of psychiatric disorders. I'm not sure about it. Maybe yes. I'm skeptical that that this would improve the situation significantly.
I'm wondering if you could start with the neurophysiology. So you've mentioned this myelination and the heat, the aspect of kind of overheating. Are you perhaps suggesting that, like, if you do a wide population scan and you find all the people who have some sort of insufficient or exaggerated myelination, or something that seems to be obscuring or preventing the optimum heat loss, would we then look at those people and find that they have a higher proportion of mental disorders, but they're just non-specific? I mean, maybe it's just like general dysfunction, and then there are other factors that might mean that ends up in bipolar or schizophrenia or autism or whatever in different cases. I don't know. I'm kind of spitballing here as to what, a way you could use this principle of the starting with the pathologies or the specific systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, would be a cool approach. I've never thought about associations with dysfunctional brain cooling and psychiatric conditions that much, but that could also be interesting. With regard to myelination, you have the problem that there are, of course, also within the brain regional differences. You can have intact myelination here and imperfect myelination there, which to a certain degree seems to depend on environmental circumstances, especially exposure to stress. I'm a fan of the work of Martin Teicher from, I think he's from MIT or Canada. He does excellent brain imaging research showing that the brain seems to respond to stresses in quite specific ways, including the way how different parts of the brain are getting connected in response to stressors. That might be an excellent way to look at more specific alterations of brain function.
It'd be really cool.
Brilliant work. I like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be really cool if you could look at all people who are exposed to the same sorts of stressors, whatever it is, like divorce or whatever, and then find that the ones who are manifesting the mental disorders are the ones who have this specific pathology. But I mean, it's perhaps optimistic that it's the golden egg, I guess.
Yeah, that's right.
Right, we have a thank you and a comment from Paul saying very interesting and enjoyable talk. So so that's from Paul, and yeah. But before we finish, just to carry on with the line of thinking that Adam just started, I was just wondering whether it would be useful to think about the kind of unique disorders unique to humans, if there are any. I mean, there is the suggestion that schizophrenia is unique to humans, and then trying to examine what is unique about human brain evolution that may then provide some handle on the unique human psychopathology or let's say phenotypes, dysfunctional phenotypes, and the other would be those that where humans resemble other non-human species, such as, for instance, I don't know, depression or anxiety. Maybe there are clearer analogues of those between humans and others, and so these two different scenarios would contrast with each other. Do you think there is any mileage in looking at those that are unique to humans and try to map them onto human brain evolution and to see what handle we can have on that?
Yeah, thanks, Riad. I think that's a very, very interesting question. I'm not sure where the uniqueness of human disorder and disease starts. So you mentioned schizophrenia. I would agree that schizophrenia does not exist in non-human animals because non-human animals simply lack certain properties that the human brain has, like language. So other animals don't hear voices, etc., etc. So the cognitive component of psychiatric psychiatric disorder could be quite unique to humans, but the emotional aspects much less so, because because the resemblance of the limbic systems of, say, other apes and humans is much higher than the resemblance of the neocortical systems.
Yeah.
So this could explain why anxiety, maybe also depression, is expressed in similar ways across a range of species. Whereas others, like say schizophrenia or maybe also OCD, is less similar. There is less similarity between humans and non-human animals, even though there are superficial similarities with stereotypic behavior also. And
I mean,
OCD,
one can also think of, let's say, autism to be
Yes.
probably
Yeah.
uniquely human. Would you agree?
I would, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, these are. I mean, if that is agreed, then that fact alone should be of great interest to evolutionists.
That's right. That's right. But still, you have to approach. I mean, you.
Sorry, Martin, your voice, the voice is gone.
Okay,
I think your microphone. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
We can hear you now.
Sorry, but you, with Adam and Paul, you just published an excellent paper where you suggested combining the Tinbergen approach with the Evo dimension.
Yes.
Which I like very much. So you have Evo, bio, psycho, and social, and you need to find explanations on all 4 levels, which could be a very useful approach to distinguish all these things between humans, but also between humans and non-human animals. Where's the difference? What is the difference at all 4 levels? And this could lead to a more specific, maybe phenotypic characterizations, but in the end, you may end up with very individual cases, because everybody is kind of dissimilar in developmental and social circumstances, etc. But I like this approach very much. I think this goes in the very right direction.
Okay,
it's not a perfect solution, but a start.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, there are a whole range of ideas around causation, and Adam, Paul, and I we just threw this in the mix so that again, as one idea to see whether it would be helpful. But I think that. I mean, with human unique conditions, I think evolution should have something to say, at least about these conditions. So, with no further hands that I can see, we can now close the session. I'd like to thank Martin again for a very right. Yes, we have a thank you there. I'd like to thank Martin again for a thought-provoking presentation.